change, to language acquisition, to language diversity. And I'm gonna kind of introduce a few projects and also the project with Yoav, but also give you background on kind of how it started. There will be no stats and stuff like this in this talk. It's going to be pretty broad. So I hope you all kind of follow and yeah, enjoy it. If you have any questions, I would prefer it at the end unless it's something crucial. Okay. So to me, one of the most interesting questions in the field of linguistics is, well, why are there so many different languages in the world? So what could be the possible sources for this astonishing linguistic diversity? I'm also interested in asking, how did different languages evolve? So what are the cognitive and communicative pressures that shape the evolution of language in our species? And finally, I wonder, how do language differ from each other in their complexity and in their learning trajectories? And what kind of mechanism enable the process of learning language across childhood and across modalities? And in my research so far, I've been trying to shed light on these questions using experimental methods and recently also computational methods, and I will showcase some of this work today. So I think the first thing to consider when talking about languages is that languages are constantly changing. If there is one universal pattern that we know 100% to be true for all languages in the world, is that if people use them to communicate with each other, those languages will change over time. And we can think of language evolution and language change as the process in which linguistic innovations or variants emerge and then spread. And in the case of the cultural evolution of language, the story is something like this. So, well, people, they innovate all the time. We randomly or intentionally produce new sound variants, create new lexical words, or use new grammatical constructions. But only some of these variants are then adopted by other people and spread to the entire community. And this process is generally named cultural evolution and is somewhat analogous to biological evolution in the sense that you have some mutations or variants and they spread in the community as a factor of natural selection, but also random changes. So I'm interested in how does this process actually occur in languages? So how do linguistic innovations emerge and then spread, and how fast do they become the new linguistic norm? So to answer these questions, I'm currently using agent-based computational modeling. In these models, I basically look at different types of populations of simulated agents. So each of these dots in this kind of graph simulates one person, an agent, and they have carefully controlled capacities. They also use different variants. And then I examine how these variants tend to spread in a population over time until most agents are using the same variants, and you can say that a norm has been established. And then I can examine how this process of conventionalization is affected by the agent's cognitive capacities and their communication pattern. So this is done by manipulating things like how stubborn or flexible these agents are. So how likely they are to adopt to other people. Do these agents have a preference for some variants over others? Something that is called content bias in this field. How many variants can they store in their memory? And who do they tend to copy from? And these types of computer models can really provide valuable insights because they break down a very complex process of language change into small kind of transparent steps. So just to give you an example, in some simulations that I've done with Bill Thompson and Will Schiller, we looked at agents' personalities. So we manipulated how likely they are to adopt and accommodate to others. So basically, whether the proportion of flexible or stubborn agents affects convergence. The results of this simulation shows that it doesn't actually have such a big impact on language change. So even if there's a lot of stubborn people, a lot of people who kind of stick to their own language and don't want to change and don't want to adopt, this only slows down the spread of variants to the entire community, but it doesn't stop it. So as long as an agent is not 100% stubborn and does accommodate even rarely, the network will eventually converge on new variants. And I'm going to get back to some more computational work later on in the talk. But now I would like to shift the focus to some of the experimental work I've done. So the first important question to ask is, how do people actually learn the variants in their language, right? So looking at language acquisition, one of the biggest questions in the field of human language is, how do children even discover the structure of their language? And more generally, how do children learn repeating patterns and regularities in their environment? And one possible answer for this is that children have what we call statistical learning abilities, the ability to implicitly detect patterns in their sensory input based on distributional properties and statistical properties like transitional probabilities and co-occurrences. So the first behavioral study I ever conducted actually looked at this crucial mechanism and asked, are statistical learning abilities stable across development, or do they change with age? And also, are learning outcomes different in different sensory modalities? So does statistical learning develop differently for visual patterns or auditory patterns? And to address this question, I conducted a large-scale study of statistical learning modalities in development, and we tested children from the ages of 5 to 12 on matching visual and auditory tasks to examine how well they learned. When I compared children's learning, I found a difference in the developmental trajectory of statistical learning across modalities. So while statistical learning improved with age for visual patterns, it was age invariant for auditory patterns. So auditory learning did not change much during childhood. It stayed pretty stable. And these results show that this kind of capacity of detecting patterns in your environment develops differently across domains, and suggest that this is not a unitary kind of stable domain general capacity, but rather modality sensitive. So next I went to examine language evolution in the lab, and specifically the emergence of linguistic structure in this process of cultural transmission. And I did this using iterated learning experiments, where participants learn a target behavior, something like an artificial language, and then their learning output is giving as input to the next participant, and so on for basically a chain of multiple generations of participants. And previous work by Simon Kirby and other colleagues showed that this kind of process can lead to the creation of systematic linguistic structure, what we call compositionality. And this effectively shifts the explanatory burden for the origin of grammar from having some biologically evolved capacity to a cultural process that shapes linguistic patterns according to our cognitive biases. But one problem I had with these experiments is that I didn't know if they work with children. So one important criticism for all these studies was that the participants in these iterated learning experiments were all adults who already speak a language. And the problem is that, older participants may benefit not only from better working memory and more sophisticated kind of problem solving strategies when they go in the lab, but also they can really rely on their previous extensive, very explicit knowledge of their language. And if this is true, then the findings from previous experiments might not be evidence for some process, underlying cultural transmission that's responsible for the evolution of language, but rather merely the result of already mastering a language. So I thought it would be really crucial to test this paradigm with children, who are the main language learners in the real world and have much more explicit knowledge of the grammar of their language. Much less explicit knowledge. So to do this, to test the role of children in the evolution of language, we designed this kind of child-friendly iterated learning experiment and compared children's performance over time. And when comparing the performance of children and adults in terms of how well they learned and how much structure they created in their languages, we found that while adults consistently created compositional languages, they significantly also outperformed children overall. And children's languages did not show such an increase in compositionality. However, they did become easier to learn in both conditions in the same manner as for adults. And children also managed to develop languages that had, on several occasions, significant systematic structure. So it's not the case that they can't do it. And I want to link this back to language acquisition, because our additional analysis showed that the differences between children and adults were related to how well they learned the language. So basically, it appeared that people who were participants, children and adults, who learned their input languages better were also more likely to introduce more structure to their output, so to regularize it. And this strengthens the relationship between learning biases and emerging structure. And this is all nice, but Next, I felt like this is not enough. I wanted to examine the process of language evolution in a more realistic setting, because in the real world, people don't just learn and transmit language from generation to generation in isolation. They actually interact with other people, and they're subjective to communicative pressures when they interact. So I wanted to test how languages can evolve in a community from scratch. So how does grammatical structure emerge as as a process of communication? So for this purpose, I developed this novel group communication paradigm that Yoav was talking about for testing how grammatical structure emerges and then spreads in a miniature community. So what I did is to bring participants to the lab and ask them over the course of several hours to create a new artificial language to communicate with each other. And participants in the same group, they interact about different types of novel scenes. They're basically different shapes that move on a screen in different directions. And I will show you an example of this in a second. And they earned points when they successfully understand each other. They're not allowed to use Dutch or English or any other language they know. They just need to come up with kind of gibberish nonsense words to describe these scenes. And I'm going to show you how a typical interaction looks like, just so you get an idea. So now what you see is the interface of two participants, the producer and the guesser. These are paired participants in a group. One participant, the producer, sees a shape moving on the screen in a given direction, and they need to provide a label for it. So let's say our producer decides to call this wape. I'm reading this in the Dutch way because this is how our Dutch participants would pronounce this word. If this word is legal, that means it's not an actual word in Dutch or in English, we pass it to their partner, the guesser. The guesser sees this word along with a grid of 8 different scenes, and they need to select the scene that they think their partner meant when they said wape. And I just want to reassure you that although this looks kind of a lot and slightly epileptic on the screen, our participants get used to this really fast. So after a few minutes, they're already experts in detecting the shapes and their movements. And then importantly, they also get feedback. So once the guesser guesses the scene, they can also, both of them, see what was the right scene and what was selected so they can learn from it for the next interaction. And these two participants, they switch roles. So they alternate between the role of guesser and producer multiple times. They play with each other for about 20 minutes, and then they switch to play with a different partner and so on. But importantly, at the beginning of this experiment, our participants are really kind of guessing the names, they're making them up randomly. But over the course of several hours, what we see is that they actually start developing linguistic patterns and regularities. So essentially, they create a grammar in which there is different part words for describing the shapes and different part words for describing their motion. And throughout the experiment, I examined these emerging languages on several measures. So I look at whether participants successfully understand each other. I look at whether the group ends up converging on a shared lexicon such that different people use the same words. I look at how much these languages change over time and how systematic and compositional these grammars end up being. And this paradigm allows me to look at how languages evolve in real time in a community and to show that such simple communication between people can lead to the creation of systematic grammars over time, which then spread to the entire community. And this work on language evolution led me to ask questions about language diversity. So why do we have so many different languages in the world with so many different levels of grammatical complexity? So one thing that may cause languages to be different is the fact that they're spoken in different social environments. So languages evolve in different communities with different population sizes, different social structures, and different social needs. And the idea is that languages may adapt to fit these different social needs. So using the group communication paradigm that I showed you just now, I was able to experimentally tease apart different social features that may affect language diversity, namely community size and network structure, and to test how these shape the evolution of languages in the lab. So focusing on the effective community size first, here I asked, how does changing the size of the group affect the languages that would evolve in this group? So does interacting with more or less people lead to a difference in languages structure? And to this end, I compared the languages that were formed in small groups of 4 people to those formed in larger groups of 8 people. And even though it's clear that both of these group sizes are very small compared to the real world, I hope to show you that in such a miniature setting of an experiment, just doubling the amount of people in the group already makes a really significant difference to the language. So basically what we found is that community size affected the grammatical structure of languages, such that big groups created more systematic languages and did so faster and more consistently. The explanation for this trend was that the need to develop systematic languages was much higher in a larger group. The idea is that when you're in a big group, you have less shared history with each other person, and you're exposed to a lot more input variability because you have a lot more different partners in the group. And in a small group, maybe you can just remember each other's unique variations. So I can remember that Yoav calls this scene Buba, and maybe Arnon calls this scene Kiki, and that would be fine because I only have to interact with 3 other people. But in a big group, this is really hard to do. It's really hard to maintain an individual memory of each person's variance. So in a way, even though convergence and mutual understanding are harder to achieve in a bigger group because there's more people you need to negotiate with, it's actually much more needed. And I'll get back to this point about convergence in bigger groups later on when I show you some more modeling work. But this means that members of bigger groups are seemingly under a stronger pressure to create languages that are more systematic, more generalizable, and more predictable, which in turn can ease their communicative challenge and help establish convergence. And these experimental findings I thought were quite exciting because they showed for the first time that community size in the lab can affect patterns of language diversity, such that the social and communicative pressures that are associated with different kind of social environments can shape the nature of languages that are created in these different communities. And interestingly, these conclusions also have important consequences for language acquisition, because if languages with more regular and compositional structure are easier to learn, which is assumed by many scholars in many different fields, going from language evolution to second language learning to language diversity, and if such languages tend to develop more in big communities, then this suggests that some languages are acquired faster than others, and that this learning advantage can be traced back to the size of the community and the degree of systematicity in the language. And this goes against a really widespread axiom in the field of linguistics, namely that all languages are equally hard to learn and take the same effort to acquire. So to test this idea, that more structured languages are easier to learn, I conducted another study, an individual artificial language learning study, where I took the final languages that were created by these big and small groups in the previous experiments, so they had different degrees of structure, and I taught them to new people, 100 new people who were not a part of the original community. And I looked at how well they learned these languages. And the results showed that languages with more systematic grammars were learned better. So participants were more accurate at reproducing more structured languages and learned them faster and more consistently. So also look at the spread. If you look at the beginning of the x-axis, these are low structured languages. There's a lot going on. Some people are really good at this. Some people are really bad at this. But if you look at so maybe there's a lot of individual variance. But if you look at the high structured language, so at the very end, the very right end of the graph, you can see that basically everyone is clustered together such that everybody almost is at ceiling in this sense. And that means that language structure was really advantageous for learning. And this confirms the relationship between systematicity and learnability. But more excitingly, I think, I wanted to see how well participants can generalize the language they learned to new unfamiliar meanings that they haven't seen before. And I actually should change this title from submitted to forthcoming because this paper is about to be published next week. I just finished the proofs for that. So hopefully it will come out in Cognition. Keep your eyes up. But the idea was that, so whether participants can really generalize the languages that they learn to new unfamiliar meanings that they've never seen before. So that is, can they apply the language they learned to new contexts? And will different people do this in the same way? So to this end, I gave participants another test. They saw 12 new scenes with new combinations of shape and direction that they have never been trained on. And they were asked to label them according to what they thought would be correct based on the language they learned. And here participants could do a lot of different things. They could, if they wanted to, make up completely new words, so not generalize at all. They could use homonyms, so replicate words that they've already learned. They could combine words, or they could use the rules of the language if there weren't any. And then I looked at how the generalizations of different participants that learned the same languages and asked whether they will be similar. So do different people generalize new scenes in the same way and use the same words despite never learning them and also never interacting with each other? And the results were overwhelming. They showed that participants who learned more structured languages were much more likely to produce exactly the same generalizations. And this finding suggests that systematicity allows strangers to converge effortlessly. People who never interacted before could potentially communicate successfully about new events and immediately be understood. And importantly, this is exactly the mechanism that I postulated for the group communication experiment I showed you, where having more structured languages facilitated convergence in bigger groups with more people. So the idea is that in a big community, because you have more strangers, people who don't communicate regularly or never interact, you cannot rely on shared history and memorization to support understanding. But they still need to be able to interact when they meet for the first time. So as such, we suggested that the members of bigger communities are under this pressure to develop languages that in turn can help convergence. And these findings here directly support this idea. They show that in a way, the benefits of linguistic structure and grammar go beyond learnability. It's not just that more grammar is beneficial for the learner, it's also advantageous for communication between individuals and aids productivity in general languages. Okay, so the next thing I looked at was network structure. So how does it have the same effect as community size? And here I asked, what happens when groups are of the same size, but they vary in how much or how members are connected to one another? So does the process of language evolution shaped by the density or the sparsity of the group? And in the previous experiment I showed you, all the groups were fully connected, right? So everybody in the group interacted with everyone else in the group. But in the real world, we know that this is rarely the case, right? Larger groups are typically more sparse, they're less connected, and some people in bigger communities never meet. So not everyone is equally connected, right? We have some people who interact with a lot of other people, and some people are more isolated. So to look at the role of network structure and density independently of community size, I compared 3 different types of networks. The first was a fully connected network. It was just like before. Everyone interacts with everyone. And this resembles early human societies, but nowadays it's quite rare. So maybe some hunter-gatherer communities or some villages still follow this kind of fully connected network. The second network was a small world network. This is in blue. These networks are much sparser. They have much less connections, actually exactly half. So we kind of take down half the connections in the network. But they're also realistic in the sense that strangers are indirectly connected. So if you look at this example, participants G and H in this network, they never directly interact, but they are connected via participant F and via participant D. That means that innovations can still flow in the network between these two people. So they can end up converging on the same language, even though they never directly speak. And the last network was a scale-free network. That's the free network. These networks have actually been argued to be the most representative of modern human societies. They're also very sparse, so they have the same number of connections as the small world, half of the fully connected. But interestingly, they follow a power law where few agents are highly connected. In this case, if you look at participant A, we call him the hub. So he is connected to almost every other person in the group. But many of the agents are less connected. So for example, participant E and D are more isolated. And here our prediction was that the sparser networks, the blue and the green networks, would create more systematic languages for the same reasons as before, because sparser networks are typically more variable. You have members with less shared history with each other and more diversity. And as such, convergence in this network is harder, but then also much more needed. So this means that sparser networks should be, that's what we predicted, under a stronger pressure to create systematic languages. Results didn't confirm this, so we found no significant differences between the 3 network conditions. All the networks in our experiment showed the same degree of high structure throughout the experiment, and also showed similar behavior patterns when looking at all the other measures I mentioned, like change over time and communicative success and convergence. And these results, in retrospect, do make a lot of sense, because we also found that the variability of the network was similar across conditions. So it was not the case that the sparser networks were really more diversified. The level of input variability here did not change between networks. And although network structure seems to have no effect, at least not when size is kept constant and relatively small in such a paradigm, it is really important not to draw any strong conclusions from these null results. It is, after all, just null results. It's very likely that network structure had no effect in the current design because our selected networks just did not differ sufficiently from each other or from other methodological limitations, or they were not big enough, and so on. So this study, I see it as a first step. And we definitely need more research in order to truly kind of understand the role of connectivity. And I have some ideas on how to improve this design for future work. If you're interested, we can talk about that later. And I think the most important thing is that I would still expect that network structure would have a role, because real world evidence shows that network structure has an effect of language diversity alongside community size. And this is really a fascinating field, I think. And it's the field of, it's a unique case of language evolution in modern times. It's the case of emerging sign languages. So this research on emerging sign languages, so these are new sign languages that are established in the last, let's say, 80 years in different communities, mostly because of high hereditary deafness genes that spread in a community really fast in some villages and so on. But these kind of emerging sign languages show that the social environment shapes the structure of emerging languages. Specifically, there seems to be a difference between what they call a village sign language. Those emerge in very small, tightly knit, homogeneous communities where people have dense connections and interact very closely with every other person in their village. And this compared to what they call a deaf community sign language, which emerged in a larger, sparser, and heterogeneous community that spread over a country. And based on a comparison between two of these, the El Said Bedouin sign languages, both of them are in Israel, actually. So Israel is a hub for studies on emerging sign languages. So there is a Israeli sign language, which is a deaf community sign language, because in the start of Israel, basically all these deaf people with their various sign languages came to Israel and had to converge on a shared language. Some spoke German sign language, some spoke British sign language, some spoke no sign language. And over the past 80 years, Israeli sign language has been formed in kind of this kind of broad setting, what we call a sparse network setting. And in contrast, El Said Bedouin sign language is a language that evolved in a Bedouin village in the Negev. And it's a very tightly close community, but the languages are of the same age. So you can compare them and see what happens. And what they found was that the languages that emerged in the small and dense community was more variable across speakers and overall less conventionalized. And in contrast, the language that emerged in the larger communities are more uniform. And this is not only based on this comparison between these two languages, but also on other languages that have been compared all over the world. So despite the fact that these languages are of the same age, they show this kind of striking difference. And so basically, this is the relationship we see. We see that convergence is fast in big communities and slower in small communities. So, so this is kind of, I'm plotting this trend here. But this is actually really surprising and stands in very sharp contrast to results from literally every other computational model out there, such as the naming game, which show that convergence is faster in small populations. So these computational models shows that the time to convergence is proportional to population size, in the sense that convergence time increases as population size, such that given the same time, a small community should be more uniform, not less. And this makes sense because it should be easier to establish a consensus with less people and harder to establish a consensus with a lot of people. So what's going on? Why do we see that these models don't fit the observations from emerging sign languages and even show the exact opposite result? So what I think is going on, my best hypothesis is that individuals' memory of other individuals plays a role here. So in the real world, when you interact with someone, you remember who you talked to and what that specific person said. And this type of source memory is surprisingly absent from typical models of language and norm emergence. I think it's really important in explaining the process of conventionalization. So in one model that I'm particularly excited about, which is joint work with Simon Kirby and Bill Thompson, we try to resolve this by introducing hierarchical structure to the model. So here we have populations of Bayesian agents. They interact with each other using different variants, but they don't just infer. So when they talk to someone, what you have in these models is you get two kind of participants, two agents in a population drawn out, they interact, they update their distributions, and they're sent back to the pool. And then the next time they interact, they kind of infer a mean over the entire population and interact again, and so on. But here we wanted the agents to also have a memory of a specific agents that they already interacted with. So basically they would keep track of who said what and build a model for both individuals and the whole population. So importantly, we also had the agents have limited memory capacity. They can only store data from, in this case, it was an arbitrary choice, 100 individuals, but if you change it, the results are the same. If they interact with known familiar agents, they use the specific variants that they remember that agent uses. But if they interact with a new unfamiliar agent, they would use the mean over the entire population. And when we run the simulations multiple times with this hierarchical model, we find that our results do mimic the patterns of emerging sign languages. So small populations converge slower, maintaining the existence of a lot of different variants in the community, while big populations converge faster and reduce the number of variants that coexist over time. And even more interestingly, we can see what kind of convergence we get in this population. So bear with me here. Look at these two plots. One represents a small population and the other is a big population. And here, each point is a pair of individuals. So we have the producer on the x-axis and the receiver on the y-axis. And at the beginning, you see no convergence. All pairs have different variants and they're kind of spread out over the screen. But over time, pairs could align. And this is indeed what happens. And importantly, when a point is aligned on the diagonal, it means that a pair is well coordinated. But when a point is clustered on the diagonal, it means that there is a kind of population-wide convention. And what we see over time is that the small communities develop stable idiolects. So pairs understand each other very well, yes, but there is a lot of variation across pairs. But in a large community, we see the formation of this kind of consensus, a community consensus. So this is really cool. We're now working on the paper to actually have this published. Okay. The next step I plan to take is to link these experimental results to data from computational modeling. So the idea is to take the patterns that are obtained in real groups of human participants during this group communication paradigm and to compare them with patterns obtained from different size populations of interacting simulated agents. And this is where the project with Yoav comes in, because in this case, the behavior of simulated agents that I showed you in the previous simulations, to be honest, it's just too simple and it's too abstract compared to what actual humans do in these kind of, on this micro scale. So the idea is to examine this process in depth using deep learning methods. And this is done with collaboration with your own brilliant Yoav at the IDC Center. And I want to say this project is in really very, very early stages. We've only just started conceptualizing it and kind of testing how it would work in the first step. Our goal is to develop a close model of participants' behavior, which will allow us to test for the first time how community size affects the languages of conversing AIs. And these AIs would be composed of several levels. I'm just going to go over this quite quickly. So first, there would be a convolutional neural network that would translate a scene to an inner representation. So kind of first teaching these agents how to see the world, so how to interpret visual information. And after that, there would be a feed-forward network that compares two representations to see if they correspond to the same scene. So basically learning how to match visual scenes. So if you get two of them, are they the same? Then there would be a recurrent neural network, encoder and decoder, that would translate these inner representations to short texts of strings and back. So basically learning how to speak and how to listen. And I just want to make a small point here and say that this actually brings us back to questions on language acquisition. So how will these artificial neural networks learn to speak and listen? How and how fast will it take them to pick up on the structure and regularities of their environment? And I think it's very likely that this would be through the process of statistical learning and Bayesian inference. So kind of tracking co-occurrences and updating probabilities of a given mapping as a result of experience as the network is exposed to more and more things. But once we have this established, we can return and look at the evolution of grammatical structures in this network. So for this end, we plan to teach them how to successfully communicate with each other. So using supervised and then reinforcement learning, that's what we were talking about. Now, the idea is that we would have different networks interact such that one network would produce a text for a target scene, just like you saw in the example I gave you. And the other network would need to match it to the right scene from a possible set of scenes. exactly the same type of interactions that we had in the experiment with human participants. And then as these networks communicate with each other, we can see whether their representations and their associated texts change as a function of interaction. So would we see the same patterns of kind of emerging compositionality in these populations of conversing AIs? And finally, with respect to language diversity, we can then manipulate the size of this AI population, right? We can see if we can replicate these experimental findings that larger populations of neural networks develop more compositional structured languages. Okay. I want to just talk briefly about 2 future projects that I'm about to work on, just in case you're interested, because we have 10 more minutes. So another really cool thing that we could do with modeling and this group communication paradigm is to investigate what I think is really new and exciting topics in community structure. So in future work, I plan to look at how age and gender diversity shape the process of language formation and innovation. And this is a really interesting question, because one of the most intriguing findings in sociolinguistics that goes back about 30 years is that the idea that speakers' gender and age can affect the process of language change. Specifically, it was suggested that women are actually the leaders of language change. So some studies show that women are often more linguistically innovative than men, and they tend to adopt new variants more frequently. And similarly, there are studies that show that teenagers around the age of 17 also tend to create and to adopt new variants much more often than adults. And we have this intuition about teenagers, that they have their own language, and the adults, as we as adults have a more kind of fixated language. But interestingly, these claims are still only based on several case studies that looked at actual language change in a few communities. And they never were tested experimentally or computationally. So we actually currently don't know how population differences in gender and age influence language evolution, language innovation, and language change, and whether different linguistic tendencies are really associated with male versus female speakers and adult versus teen speakers. So in a future project, my goal is again to couple experimental methods with modeling to determine whether women and adolescents really lead the process of language change from the very initial stages of emergence. So I will use my group communication paradigm and simulated populations of these hierarchical Bayesian agents I mentioned before, and manipulate the composition of these microsocieties in terms of the gender and age of individuals. So for example, we can test different groups of participants, which are either homogeneously men, men biased, gender balanced, women biased, or homogeneously women. And similarly, either they're composed only of teenagers, only of adults, or have an age balance. So will such changes in the identity of group members influence the creation and spread of linguistic norms over time? And is it really the case that women and children are more, when teenagers are more likely to create these kind of novel variants and then to adopt them from other people? And here the computational model would be hierarchical, but we would have yet another additional layer of memory, depending on the social features of age and gender. So each agent would remember the variance of specific individuals, just like before, but they would also have a mean over subpopulations. So for example, what kind of variants are typically used by teenagers and which kind of variants are typically used by adults? And of course, they would also have this representation of the entire population, so a mean of means, if you may. And when interacting with someone new for the first time, the agents could choose the appropriate variant based on their estimation of the subpopulation this person is coming from. So they can use a typical adult variant when they speak to an agent that is an adult, and so on. Okay. And finally, going back to the questions on language evolution, I'm currently in the process of adapting my group communication paradigm to virtual reality environments, which offers really high ecological validity and a more naturalistic setup, while still allowing for high experimental control. We already have the stimuli for this experiment that's really cute. It's going to be composed of these kind of different novel creatures that would vary in their shape, in their size, in their movement type, so whether they hop or walk and so on, and their movement speed, so how fast they hop or how fast they walk. And the goal of this adaptation is to test how modality differences affect the process of language evolution. So specifically, we plan to compare the process of language formation when using gestures, when using vocalizations, or when using both. And this goes back to a really kind of long-standing question in the field of language evolution, which was what was the origin of the first languages? Were they spoken or signed or both? And looking at how gestural and vocal languages are formed in the VR environment, we can not only examine this multimodal origin of language, we can also ask, what are the comparative advantages and disadvantages of each modality during the emergence of a novel communication system? And in this case, I predict that grammatical structure and iconicity will emerge in both modalities. So you can imagine, for example, the size of the creatures being expressed iconically in the signed modality by using bigger gestures. But they can also be expressed iconically in speech by using low versus high vowels that have been shown to be associated with size. So ah is typically big and e is typically small, at least in the beginning when you have kind of people making associations. But in any case, we predict that systematic grammars would emerge over time in both modalities, but maybe faster in vocalizations because they have a relatively lower affordance for iconicity compared to signs and gestures. And using this VR paradigm, we can also examine questions related to language diversity. So I plan to ask whether languages adapt to pressures in their physical environment, things like adverse or noisy conditions. So what happens when we kind of make these modalities a bit harder to communicate in? So would adaptations occur? And in particular, we plan to introduce wind to the VR environment by basically playing a sound on the speaker that masks the S sound in language. And our prediction is that in such a windy environment, so to say, the vocal languages would include less S sounds, or even not at all, since these sounds would be hard to detect. And similarly, we plan to manipulate the environment to have poor lighting. And in this case, we predict that the sign languages will adapt by making gestures even larger and more salient. And such adaptations can also influence the interplay between iconicity and systematicity, because imagine that if now you have to, larger gestures can no longer be used to indicate larger creatures because everything becomes larger in the dark, it may force participants to shift away from iconicity to more arbitrary gestures. And I think this would be a very interesting example of how the basic building blocks of language are shaped by their physical environment. Okay, so that's it. To conclude, my research so far has kind of focused on linking these three things: language evolution and change, language acquisition, and language diversity, by using this kind of range of behavioral paradigms and computational models. And my goal was and still is to uncover the time course, the social dynamics, and the cognitive mechanisms that characterize each of these processes and see how they're related. And also there's many more projects that I didn't talk about here, but they all share the same kind of goal, and that is to promote what I hope is a multifaceted understanding of the complex interplay between communication and cognition in our species. So that's it. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to stop my presentation